Natalie and Tara, how are you guys doing today?
Hi, thanks for having
We're doing
us.
good. We're excited for the convo.
Thanks for coming on. Yes, no, me too. As we were talking a little bit before getting online, I'm really excited about this conversation. Was really pumped to come across you guys and be able to bring you on the show. We've had a couple episodes in the past where we've been able to talk a little bit about regenerative agriculture, and we've had Rob Wolf on and Dr. Anthony Gustin, and this is a kind of an area that I've really gotten interested in over the last couple of years. I moved out to I live in Florida now, but I'd moved out to Austin, Texas back in 2018, and got really plugged into like the farmers markets out there, and got a chance to meet a lot of farmers that were doing really cool things. And that was kind of my first introduction into really any of this. And I've gotten super passionate into it. Been reading Wendell Berry and some of the kind of iconic people in the space, watching like Joel Salatin's stuff. So just really excited to get into it. But kind of want to give you guys an opportunity to tee up talking about kind of how you guys got here, because I know reviewing your guys' social media and everything, saw that this isn't necessarily where you guys had come from. I think, was it Natalie, you had a background that was in pharmacy, if I'm not mistaken, right? And Tara, I know that you have I think a back, like your family has done some of the milk production for a long time. But I'm just curious to know kind of how you guys have gotten into this space and what drew you to it.
Yeah, so I'll start, Tara here. Yeah, I'm a fifth generation dairy farmer,
Hmm.
and I married a fifth generation dairy farmer. So there is lots of dairy in my family history, to say the least. And I actually, though, got my degree in environmental science. So I have been working as an environmental consultant for the last, gosh, I said 10 years the other day, but I think it's been like 12 years. And as I was doing that, I realized there was a ton of misinformation out there online around agriculture, around dairy farming. So I kind of wanted to set the record straight, which is what really drew me to start sharing online, and kind of like telling my story. And as I was telling my story, there wasn't a ton of like women in ag sharing online at the time. And I ended up meeting Natalie online, and we became fast friends online. And then 2 years ago, we met in real life for the first time. And at the end of 2021, beginning of 2022, we really launched our businesses together and started our podcast, Discover Ag. And I'll let Natalie jump in here.
So, Natalie here. Like Tara, I did grow up in agriculture. I actually grew up in Southwest Montana on a cattle ranch there, which to some listeners, they may immediately think of Yellowstone. And there are some similarities and definitely some non similarities between a TV show and reality. But as you mentioned, I ended up getting my degree in pharmacy. And so after I graduated, I did not come back to the family ranch. I was living in a bigger city in Montana, which is obviously a relative term. But for Montana, it's a bigger city. And I was practicing full time pharmacy. I was at a hospital and a slash clinic there. And I really thought that'd be my life. I was pretty content doing that. And then I met my husband, who was a ranch boy from Nebraska. And that's how I ended up down here in Nebraska. And my life kind of came full circle when we got married. I ended back on the ranch, just in a different state, I guess. And like Tara said, I'd been sharing online as well. When I moved, I started kind of just sharing what we were doing here on our operation in Nebraska, and it took off. And I met Tara, and then, like she said, we still share individually, but we also have our joint businesses, and then our podcast, Discover Ag.
Very cool. And I love that you guys are doing the sharing it online thing too, because for people who didn't grow up around this, and especially if you live in a city, you're pretty far removed from a lot of this stuff. It's not really something that you have to experience in your day to day. And I think it's cool. And it seems like there's a growing kind of like there's a demand for this information. People are starting to care a little bit more about food production and food quality. And I think the environmental component of food has always been there. But as you guys have highlighted, it's kind of been, there's a lot of misinformation around it, right? Like the kind of the story for the last couple of decades has been, if you care anything about the environment, and you want to kind of try to make an environmental impact with your food choices, that you should be going plant-based, right? And anything that's animal-based is, just destruction of the environment. I have people in my family that think this. No, I have close friends of mine that have gone vegan because and it's always challenging because it's always based in good things, right? Like they want to do good. They're if they're willing to sacrifice eating a steak for the greater good of humanity, that's a pretty noble thing to do. I don't know if, even if that was true, if I would do that as much as I love eating steak. But I think it's really important that this other side of the conversation is coming out, and having it come from people like yourselves who are actually like in it, and you're like, we can, somebody like myself, I put out this type of information because I'm passionate about it, but I don't own a farm. I've never worked on a farm. I am from a rural area, but it's just, I don't have that same background. So it's just a little bit of a diluted message. And what you guys are putting out is like very practical, and it's real life because you guys are actually living it. So just to start with, kudos to you guys for what you're doing.
Thank you.
One of the things I kind of want to get into is because you both are on the for the layman person, I guess you're both on the cow side of farming, but on different side of it. Natalie, you're doing more of the cattle side, whereas Tara, you're doing more dairy farming. And I actually recently met somebody out in Nashville who is more on the dairy side as well. And is that something that you do typically see separated, where if you're into dairy, you kind of stick into dairy; if you're into cattle, you're sticking more into like cattle for meat, or do you see an integration between the two at all?
Yeah, so it's definitely two separate businesses. Dairy
Mhm.
farming and cattle ranching are like worlds apart. Basically, the only commonality is that we both have cattle, but there is some crossover from dairy to beef. When our cows ultimately are no longer milking cows, they ultimately go for beef. And then another
Mhm.
piece that dairy plays in the beef system is kind of new, I guess, or it's definitely changed a lot in the last couple years, but it's what we call beef on dairy, which is where our cows that are not being bred back into our herd, our milking herd, are bred specifically for beef. And so it's called beef on dairy. And they end up going, we sell them, when they're calves. And a lot of times we sell them to a cattle ranch like Natalie's, and they go there and are raised out on a cattle ranch. And again, have completely like are not involved with dairy at all. So very separate, but with dairy, there is a little overlap into the beef world.
I always joke I would never want to work on a dairy
Yeah.
because they're they're very time sensitive with like milking, and it's just a lot more rigorous of a process, and than I guess ranching in especially in central Nebraska. So I'm happy to stick to beef.
Yeah. That's great. Well, I do have some questions. I guess maybe to start on the dairy front. So, maybe Tara, you'll be the one to kind of field some of these. But, I know that there's a lot of misconceptions around dairy, and I want to get into those, also. But starting a little bit more on the actual practices of it itself, what is kind of the biggest difference between, a lot of people when they talk about dairy farming, they talk about, animal cruelty and the environmental impact of it and all of these different things. And if there is any truth to some of that, maybe you can debunk a lot of it. I'm assuming that a lot of that truth would come from more of like the commercialization of it. These like large, operations, probably differing a lot from your operation. So, what is the biggest difference between how you're doing dairy farming versus, let's say, the big producers who are responsible for putting a lot of the milk that's on, the grocery store shelves?
Yeah, I'm glad you started here. So,
Mhm.
honestly, by like all activist standards, if you came on our dairy, we would be quote unquote a factory farm. We are a large scale
Mm,
dairy farm. And I say that
mm,
while my backyard is our close up pen. I live about 100 steps to our milking barn. So there's a lot of misconception around like size. That's probably one of the biggest ones is that like big means bad, and that
mhm.
big means not family owned and operated, when really 98% of all dairy farms in the United States are family owned and operated, no matter their
Wow.
size. And so that's, I mean, right there is like a huge misconception. And we have in our family, there is 7 family members that are full time on the dairy. And then I work in the environmental consulting side of things. So working on the manure management, the soil health, water conservation. And then obviously we have a team of people as well. I mean, we have a veterinarian that comes in once a week to do herd health checks. We have a nutritionist that plans all of our cows' diets. It's there's a lot more that goes into it than people realize.
Yeah. And how does that differ, Natalie, from on the cattle side of it? I guess, to make sure that I'm teasing, how should I call these separately? Is it a cattle operation
Yeah,
versus a dairy
you're
operation?
doing
Is that
great. It's
appropriate?
like you're immersed in the
Okay,
culture.
good. Just on the fringe of it. But how does that misconception differ from the cattle side of it? Because I know, that's, the concentrated feeding operations. People always talk about those. Is it a similar story there, where it actually is a lot of these bigger operations are family owned on that
Yeah,
side as
so I
well,
think
or is there
one
a
thing that
difference?
might take people back about the beef industry, and again, I'm glad we're diving into this because I think a lot of people lump animal proteins together. So they'll lump like pork. chicken and cattle together, and they're all raised completely differently. And so when it comes to the beef industry, the average herd size is only 43 when it comes to US cattle ranches, which is tiny. If you think about the average, American rancher only owns 43 cows, and that's really what makes up, our US beef system. What's unique about the beef system versus like protein or chicken is that we're not vertically integrated. So when and that's kind of why we get away, or why we have, such small herds, and a majority of us across the states, is because it's not vertically integrated. So one person isn't owning it from, start to finish. So if you think about chicken, like Tyson may own from the very beginning to the very end. That is not the way, cattle works. Actually, it's been shown that cattle change ownership about 5 times from the time they go to, pasture all the way to plate. So when people talk about like factory farming in the beef industry, it just kind of rubs me wrong, because like I said, it's really family ranches like mine that make up, the beginning. Like you said, eventually you will get to the stage where if it's not a grass finished product, it is going to be entering like a feedlot. But even that, I mean, there are definitely bigger feedlot operations. I will not deny that. But again, it's going to be a majority across the US. It's family operated feedlots that are going to be, finishing the cattle. Obviously, when you get to the packing stage of beef, it is the big four. Everyone has heard of the big four. I am completely fine calling the big four factory farming if you want to. They are factories, absolutely. But anything before that, I'm pretty passionate about standing firm in that it's like a family that is raising your beef.
That's super helpful to know because yeah, kind of along the lines I was mentioning at the beginning, like a lot of us are really far removed from having any understanding where our food comes from. We go to the supermarket, we buy a package of beef, or we buy milk, and we don't really think anything of it, right? Or and because of that being removed from it, when we hear these stories, I think that's why these misconceptions are so easily run with, really on both sides of it. Whether you're for it or against it, is just because if you're so far removed from it, you hear like, oh, this is what this looks like. So you assume that it's all bad. And I think that's really challenging because, there's not a lot of people that are maybe willing to look past those kind of initial little, tidbits of information that they get about something to really understand what's going on with these operations. You guys both talked about feeding, and I think that that's something interesting. I'd like to talk about, like the nutrition of the cows that you guys are working with. So the grass fed thing is something that is obviously really popular. I think people love to be able to slap that grass fed label. I think I see it on the dairy side as well. Slap that label on there and increase the price by a couple of dollars. What is this something that what is your guys' approach, I guess, to nutrition, and what's your thoughts on grass fed versus grass finished and grain finished and things like that?
So one thing you'll hear Tara and I say all the time, even if you listen to our podcast or if you follow us on our personal channels, you know that we stand for food choice. So I think when it comes
Mm.
to, and maybe Tara can add more to this, but I think she'll kind of say the same thing when it comes to the milk side. We're I think there are pros and cons to both. So grass finished versus, grain finished. I think it's important we have the choices in our food system. I think people should be able to make the choice for themselves. I think what we stand for is making sure people have all the information so that the choices they are making are made, from a standpoint of, I guess, factual information. And so, yeah, we can kind of get into more of the details if you want, but I think there's a need and a market for grass finished, and I think there's a need and a market for grain finished too.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's great. And, because it's one of those things where, like, I guess maybe take a step back. I'm assuming when you talk about the choice, are you kind of referring to like the economics of it, like
Yeah.
people being able to opt for, meat and dairy at
Yeah,
different price
exactly. So I
points?
think obviously coming from like the US food system, I will always say that we're pretty lucky to have like a safe, affordable, and abundant food system, right? Like we're not spending, I think there's even studies out
Mm.
there that show like the amount of dollars households spend, and it's very low compared to their income of what we spend on food. I think that's great. I think affordability is needed. I think consumerism, everyone kind of has this idea of what they want in life until it actually comes down to it. And so I think like the fast food, the DoorDash, the all the things we have built into the convenience of our food system, we really love as a society. But then on the other hand, I think it goes down to like, the benefits of cattle grazing, which would be a pro to grass finished. I think it also goes down to like soil health. I think it also goes down to maybe supporting, your farmers at a more local level. So again, there's just pros and cons to either or. For me, it never comes down to a nutritional thing. I see, and I think studies right now, I think they're doing more studies on them, but studies right now would support like not a major nutritional difference between grass finished and grain finished. So if someone is, making grass finished for a nutritional standpoint, I would maybe, just look into that a little bit more. But if you want to make it from like I want to support my local farmer and they happen to be grass finished, or, I like the idea of cattle grazing longer, then I think grass finished is better. But I'm going to keep talking for a second. Sorry, Tara. One thing I also think it's important to note is that when people think of grain finished, I think they think of a cow like maybe consuming corn for their entire life cycle, or like just plain corn. And that's not true either. Whether a cow is grass finished or grain finished, they spend about 2/3 of their life on pasture. It's completely the same for a grass finished cow versus a grain finished cow. The last few months is the difference. So again, um, families like mine would raise it out at pasture. If it's grass finished, it would end up having, the last 4 to 6 months of its life approximately would end up having just grass in its diet. Whereas the grain finish is going to enter, like a more conventional feedlot and get fed that mixture of grain and other byproducts.
Got it. Yeah, that's really helpful because I feel like a lot of times you'll see these like posts on social media. There'll be a comparison between the two, and it'll be like a cow living on these like beautiful pastures, living how they're supposed to, versus like this cow like being locked up and put in like a cage and being fed, and people think that that's like those are two completely separate things. But to your point, it's the beginning stage of life looks the same for all of them for the most part. And the health and nutrition side of it, that's something that I've kind of changed my tone on that a little bit over the last couple of years as I've started to understand it more, where it's like, you don't have to like, you don't necessarily need to make these decisions of grass fed, grass finished, or like, going to a farmer's market and prioritizing a certain type of meat for the nutritional side of it. But if you do care about the environmental side, and you said, like you said, supporting local farmers, then that would be a reason why, people talk about voting with your food dollars. That would be a reason why to vote with those food dollars. But if you're somebody who's not in the financial position to be able to do that, that's always my biggest thing. Like you said, having choices is that, we don't want to discourage anybody. Like meat is a really important part of the human diet. Animal protein, animal fats, really important. There's a study that was published recently looking at like the development of children when they're consuming red meat versus not consuming it, and it's really significant difference between the two. So you don't want to discourage people from eating that way. But one kind of, I guess, final question on the nutrition side that I have is, looking at like the micronutrient macronutrient profile. We typically don't see a lot of differences, but what about things like if you're feeding like corn, soy, or grain fed at the end, and things like glyphosate and these other chemicals, is that something that we should be concerned about from a nutritional aspect?
Do you want me?
I feel like I am not an expert enough on that to give a ton of information. But Natalie,
Mhm.
did you, I kind of cut you off. Sorry. Is there something you wanted to add?
So, again, my background is in pharmacy, but I've had this conversation with my husband
Yeah.
who did attend school. He got his degree in animal science and then he got his master's in ruminant nutrition. And so I've had this conversation with him before because I do think there's a narrative out there that like cattle shouldn't be having corn. The corn is going to be unhealthy for them. If a cow is eating corn, it's unhealthy, then you're putting an unhealthy product in your body and then you're unhealthy. And I do personally disagree with that statement. I don't even know if there's studies out there that show that. I'm not sure where the original narrative for that came from. Um, if you look at a cow, it is, by science, a ruminant, which would fall under the same thing as like an elk,
Mhm.
deer, sheep, goats. Those are all ruminants. If you look at the natural diet of elk and deer, they are out. They consume grains. It's part of their natural diet. And so I think if we had a cow, again, let's say it was, undomesticated, it was just out in nature, I think you would see it naturally, grazing grain. I do not think at certain quantities that it is unhealthy for the animal. I think it's a natural part of their diet. Obviously, I think too much of anything can be bad for an animal. And so, if you stepped into the territory of, feeding only corn to a cow, then yeah, you're going to have problems probably with the animal and it probably isn't, would be unhealthy. But I think the way, our food system is set up, like Tara said, we work with, that's people's jobs is to be a ruminant nutrition where they come and they visit ranches. That's their job. They go around and they set up diets for their cows. And so we are keeping a close eye on, what's being fed, how much is being fed. And a lot of it depends on the stage of the animal, how old they are. There's a lot of different things that they would need different amounts. And so my personal opinion, along with my husband's obviously, is that, corn is a natural part of a ruminant's diet and it's not bad for them.
I'll
Yeah.
I'll add to that too is I think when people think about corn being fed to cows, they literally think of like a corn on the cob. And a lot of what both Natalie and I like feed our cattle is actually what's called corn silage. And it's where we chop the entire plant. So it's more like a Southwest salad than it is a corn on the cob. Like it has all the leaves from the corn plant, it has the stalks, it has it all ground up. It's a green color with like sprinkled in corn. And I don't think people realize that. Like if you pulled up to like a corn silage pile, you wouldn't immediately be like, "Oh, that's corn." It is just like a green plant chopped up. And so that always
Hmm.
is one of those things when we do dairy tours, really surprises people.
Yeah. No, that's really helpful. And yeah, I think it's it's interesting like when you look at the kind of the science of a ruminant animal and how they digest things, and it's like, they're able to do this
Mhm.
nutrient upcycling where they can take something that would, to us as humans would not be very nutritious, or we would not really be able to access the nutrients in it, and they're able to kind of cycle these nutrients up to being beneficial things. They can create, the amino acids they need, the fats, the butyrate, all of that stuff. But I'm curious on that note. I've heard of different ideas around, because of this fact that like you can kind of get away with feeding cows. They don't necessarily have to be fed on pasture. You can feed them these other things. I've heard about different approaches to environmental impacts of, like, down here in Florida, for instance, if you were to feed cows like orange peels or things like that to kind of get rid of them instead of those sitting in these big piles where they're giving off some sort of like greenhouse gas when they're decomposing, that we could like feed them to cattle as a way, and then the cattle would be able to upcycle those nutrients into something that we could then use as humans. Is that something that you guys are doing, or something that you guys support the idea of?
Absolutely. Natalie's talked about grazing cattle, but our cattle are in confinement. They're in large open
Mhm.
pens because we bring them in to milk them twice a day. So by proximity, we need them to be close to our barn to be able to bring them in to milk. And so one of the really great things about what our cattle eat is all of these byproducts. And I actually hate the word byproducts because it makes it sound like a waste when really it's a
Yeah.
really valuable product for them. And this ranges like, there's so many different things that cattle can eat. I always joke they were like the original, like, quote unquote local eaters because what your cows are eating in Florida is not going to be the same as what my cows are eating in New Mexico. And so you mentioned like citrus pulp, orange peels. You can feed like in our area, we have a lot of cotton. So our cows, there's a seed
Mm.
when you make cotton, when the cotton ball is removed, there's a seed left over. And our cattle eat that seed. And it's a really great source of protein. In California, they can eat almond hulls. It ranges across the board, and byproducts from ethanol can be fed to cattle. Goes on and on. And one of the really cool things is, like you said, if you were to take the cattle out of the situation and have all those byproducts, if you were to compost all of those byproducts, which is, let's be honest, a best case scenario, probably wouldn't be composted. But if you composted it, it would increase greenhouse gas emissions by 5 times. If those byproducts ended up in a landfill, which is the most likely scenario, it would increase greenhouse gas emissions by 49 times. So by adding the
Wow.
cattle, we are reducing the greenhouse gas impact while also, like you said, upcycling these nutrients. Ruminant animals are the only thing on the planet that can take incomplete protein and turn it into complete protein. And they actually turn 60 grams of incomplete protein into 100 grams of complete protein, which is really
Wow.
incredible when you're considering the fact that, like, we would be throwing these products away, but instead we're turning it into a nutritious product that we can all consume.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
Tara said, it's gonna be individual, or a lot of it's based on geographical, I guess is a better way to say it. So again, and for anyone listening
Mhm.
that's like interested in putting a visual to this, if you follow Tara and I on our personal channels, I mean, we show this, so if you're like, this sounds really weird, like they're taking cotton seeds, or so in my area, we feed distillers grains because we have a lot of corn in, corn belt. I'm in, central Midwest. So we finish our cattle on a
Mhm.
combination of hay, silage, like Tara said, which would be kind of the whole plant, and then we mix in distiller grains. And I show them, and when you see them, it's not, you're like, oh, that's normal. It looks like, some, I don't know. It just going back to our original conversation when you talked about the fear creeps in, there's a nutritionist I follow online, and one of my favorite things she says is that the further we are from the food system, the more fear we have around it, or the less you just don't know about it. And so these
Mhm.
questions pop in. And so if you're interested in just like seeing this and like having more of a visual to it, follow us on our personal, because like we show it all. And once you see it, I don't think it's as, weird or unnatural as it sounds. Like you said, like you're feeding orange pulp, but like it 86% of what cattle eat is actually, non-edible by humans. And so you could put yourself in California and they're feeding almond hulls, and we're doing distillers grains here, and you guys have citrus pulp, and the amount of waste we are taking from other industries, and then, like we said, feeding it to cattle and turning it into protein. It's pretty crazy. And it's done across the entire United States.
Yeah, and it's like it's super important too because if you're, we have all this talk of, especially I saw was it a couple weeks ago the FDA had approved the lab grown, meat and things like that, like people trying to remove animal agriculture completely, and those are the things that people aren't thinking about, right? They're not thinking about, okay, you talk about what did you say, a 49 times increase in greenhouse gas emissions if some of these were, these byproducts were just left to decompose or put into a landfill or something like that. So there's all these like downstream effects that people aren't really thinking about. And that kind of leads me, I want to get into the greenhouse gas side of it a little bit, because this is something that I think there's a lot of misconceptions around. I feel like it's one of the biggest kind of pushbacks that people have. You look at a lot of these studies, and we can talk about, this is the one part that I've gotten into quite a bit. Being that my background's more in like the science side of it, I read a lot of research, and looking at the data of the comparisons that they make between animal farming versus plant agriculture with greenhouse gas emissions. It's ridiculous what they're doing with that data. But I feel like this is kind of one of the biggest things that people are using as kind of a thing against animal agriculture, is that, oh, let's look at all this methane that they're producing, and all of this, the CO2 and all these things, and this is the reason why we have these these different environmental issues and the ozone layer, and all of this different stuff. So well, let's just talk about that as a whole, so that we, because I think one of the things for people listening to this podcast, you're not going to have to do a lot of convincing of people on this podcast of what you guys talking about being important. But what I think is great is equipping people with ways to combat those. Like, if I post something on social media about this, I'm going to get, I get attacked by like the vegan community when people saying these buzz phrases or just kind of regurgitating things that they've heard. And sometimes you're not armed with like information to be able to combat that. So what is the deal with greenhouse gases and animal agriculture, and what do people need to know?
Gosh, there is so much here that we could touch on, but I think the first thing is that methane is a very small percentage of the overall amount of greenhouse gas. Like I'm talking like people are always like, "Oh, methane is the second highest greenhouse gas." It's second by like Natalie, do you have the exact one? It's like
Mm-hmm.
80% is CO2 and 20% is
It's
methane.
79 and 11%.
Thank you.
Wow.
And then from that, only about one third of methane produced is from cattle. The rest of it is from landfills, natural gas petroleum systems, and coal mining, and a number of other things. So you're talking like you just keep getting like smaller and smaller as you break up those percentages. And animal ag actually overall counts for less than 4% of total US greenhouse gas emissions. And if there's a study out there that is really great that if you removed all animal agriculture from the United States, it would only reduce our carbon footprint by about 2.6%, but it would create some massive nutrient deficiencies as well as unintended consequences like lack of manure for natural fertilizer,
Mm,
lack
yep.
of consuming all these byproducts that we just talked about. And so there's just not good standing on the idea that like giving up animal agriculture is what's going to like solve the climate crisis. It is so much more nuanced than that. There's so much more going on from soil health to the nutrition side that it's not that simple.
Yeah, for that 4%, is that also taking into consideration things like you just mentioned, like of them eating byproducts that would otherwise maybe be contributing to that number, or is it taking into consideration? I hear about like the the greenhouse gas sequestration, when animals are out kind of living how they're supposed to. Does that 4% also take that into consideration?
The byproducts is one of those things that cattle consuming byproducts is not well calculated. It is very difficult to
Okay.
figure out exactly like what removal that is. There's a big
Mhm.
push right now to figure that out because it would make a big difference in knowing what our actual like life cycle analysis would be. But currently as
Yeah.
we stand, animal agriculture or actually sorry, all of agriculture is actually a carbon sink. So all of ag and forestry produce about 10% of our greenhouse gas emissions and they remove 11%. So already all
Mm.
of ag together is a carbon sink. And I think that the more data we get, actually, the better it's going to be for ag, and that we're going to see those numbers continuing to improve as we get a better grasp on exactly what goes into those life cycle analysis.
The other thing I think it's important to note when people, like you said, you're entering into this conversation, maybe you shared something or a statistic or, whatever it is you put out there, and now you're having to deal with like kind of this conversation around it. When it comes to methane, I think it's important because everyone loves to say like it's so much more potent than carbon dioxide, which it is. Like we're not denying that it's absolutely, more potent of a greenhouse gas than carbon is. But it's also short-lived gas, which is like the like after the comma when everyone just like stops at, when it's like potent, the comma and the rest of the sentence is that it's short-lived. And so it actually is broken down 10, I think 10 to 12 years, whereas carbon is around for centuries. And so the cool thing about
Mm.
agriculture when it comes from our methane standpoint and why there's a lot of focus on, the agriculture industry putting into reducing our methane is because if we can keep our production constant, we could actually be, net zero, right? It's kind of like if you think of a bathtub, and the water is draining. If it's carbon, you have a plug in the bathtub and it's just filling up, and you're just accumulating more and more. When it comes to methane, it's like the plug is pulled and it's just water continually running through. And so if we can get to the level where what we're producing is what we're taking out, then we're not going to see the consequences and the effects of the methane industry. And so or our contribution, I guess, to it. And so I think it's important to note that yes, it is more potent, but it is a shorter form gas. And that's often really missed in a lot of conversations. The other thing I want to touch on that you guys have both brought up, with this unintended consequences, these ripple effects, like what happens if we move the cattle? Sure. Methane production goes down. Like Tara said, it's not a huge percentage, but yes, like absolutely we're contributing to, we have a global footprint, we're contributing to it. No one's talking about like the byproducts of what the animals are used for, right? So animals are used in medicine, like conventional, very important medicine. They're used their heart valves, like animals are used for that. It's in everyday products. It's in our air filters. It's in our tires. Like animals, it's in capsules, like gelatin is from animals. And so when we talk about, what would the everyone's like the world, our global footprint would go down if we didn't have animal agriculture, but it would have unintended consequences, not just for the food industry, but a lot of other industries that use it in, the manufacturing of those products.
Yeah, that's really good to know. I think that that's, a missing piece of it, and I think it's just a general like trying to oversimplify a really complex thing, right? I think people just look at it, they try to look at just these like individual data points or these statistics that are thrown out there, and it becomes really easy to get behind it. And I think a lot of it does come from good intentions, right? Like people want to do better, they're trying to do better for the environment, trying to do better for health, their animal cruelty, they're worried about that, like all these different things, but they're not really seeing like the full picture. And I do want to get into the animal cruelty thing a little bit too, because I think there's some really good misconceptions there that are worth digging into. But I think it's oversimplifying a really complex problem. And in my eyes, being removed from it, but just with the information that I have now, is that it seems like there's not really a path forward for us where we don't have animal agriculture being a part of our society. Whether it's looking at what impact it would have on our environment, what impact it would have on the food system, the impact they would have on the pharmaceutical industry, and all these other things. It seems like it makes no sense for us to actually think that that would be the route to go. I'm curious, before we get into like the more of like the animal cruelty side of it, looking at the food industry as a whole and how animal agriculture is being carried out on like kind of I guess we can start maybe at a national level here in the United States. What are some of the things that you guys think need to change, or is there things that need to change? Do you think that, are things going better than what people think they are? Or is there just some major things that we can kind of point to and say, okay, if we could improve this, we could have better outcomes that more people could get behind?
I think there's always things that we can improve on, but I think things are good and getting better. Like, I believe, like,
Mhm.
looking back over the history of dairy, I think animal welfare has never been better. I know you've brought that up a couple times and we might dive into that, but animal welfare is the
Mhm.
best it's ever been. Genetics in our cattle is of, like, absolute science of what's going into that now, and that our cows are just healthier at their genetics than they've ever been. And so I personally am excited about the future of where our food is going. And that's not to say there isn't changes we couldn't make and things we could do differently. But as a person, and I feel like probably Natalie feels the same, as a person who produces a whole foods product, I am so proud of that. That you can go to the grocery store. Both of our products are a single product, single ingredient product, and a super nutrient dense product. And I think that there's only, like, we can only make improvements on what we have and continue to do better.
This is like such a loaded question for me.
Yeah.
And it's actually something that Tara and I have been talking about on our podcast a lot is kind of this idea. I think for me, it comes down to like a globalized food system versus a localized food system. And honestly, I think it really comes down to
Mm.
then again, your values on that, right? So if you were to maybe ask a person living in, a very urban setting that maybe has a lower income, they would probably say that, maybe their food access is great. They don't have a problem with our food system. She's able, I'll use a mom, she's able to go to the grocery store. She's able to put, like you said, it's important that we're providing a healthy animal protein for them to put on the plate of themselves and their children. And so she's like, I can go to the grocery store. I have access to it. It's at an affordable price. I can get home, get this meal on the plate of my kids. I think our global food system's great. It's affordable, it's safe. I don't have to worry about anything. Her values are going to be a little bit different than maybe, Austin, like using your foods, scene in Austin. They're pretty connected, I would say, to, maybe shopping at the farmer's market and maybe sourcing from like a local rancher. And so they may look at our global food system and say, yeah, there's a lot of problems. We need to shift to a more localized where we're not exporting and importing and we're not mass producing. And, I have the dollars to pay a higher amount and that's where I want my dollars to go to. And so, again, I think we take for me, it's a value based question. And the answer is really going to depend on, the person's values answering it. For me personally, like Tara said, I am very proud of, again, we're a larger operation or a conventional one, I guess you could say. We're not grass finished. But it's just my husband and I, and we have one employee. And I'm really proud of what we do. We're running our cattle in the Nebraska Sandhills area. It's very beautiful. We're putting, protein on the shelves. And I feel like I'm doing my part, when it comes to environmental and land stewardship. And so, yeah, there's faults in our food system. But also, again, I go back to it's affordable, it's safe, and it's abundant. And I'm like Tara said, I'm proud of the product that from start to finish of what we're putting out from the beef industry.
That's really cool. I love that. And I'd love to talk a little bit about the local side of it too, because I know that a lot of people who are, proponents of, improving, agriculture as a whole kind of really lean on this local idea, right? That, we need to get all of our food locally. And I think the one interesting part on kind of going back on the greenhouse gases, I forget the exact study that I had looked at, but it was a study where they were comparing, like the carbon footprint of animal agriculture versus plant agriculture, and they were showing that animal agriculture was like astronomically higher than plant agriculture. But what was really interesting is that they weren't looking at, they were comparing on the animal agriculture side, from, like getting like all the way to getting it on the shelves, right? So like the majority of that carbon footprint was actually transportation of, like packaging it and transporting it and shipping it, all of those different things. Which to me, when I saw that, which, for everybody on that study, they weren't comparing that same thing on the plant agriculture. They were basically stopping the calculations once the food, was essentially leaving the farm, to simplify it. So they were comparing apples to oranges there, which wasn't really a fair comparison. But for me, not knowing as much, I see that and I'm like, okay, well then it sounds like we would, focusing on a more localized food system would be better from an environmental perspective, because you would be able to get your food, from, like, you can go to your local farm, you can support your local economy, your local farmers. You can drive, like I do have the luxury of having a farmer's market, very close here, half a mile, where I can go talk to the farmer that I'm getting my meat from, all these different things. But I know there's some flaws to that too. And there's some questions about how practical that is on a national scale, or even a global scale. So, what are your guys' thoughts around the local thing? Like, is that something that we should be focusing on trying to improve our ability to feed our local communities versus a more national scale? Or is this something that it's not practical to do that, so that's not really where we should be focusing?
Yeah, so I'll jump in. I feel like it's not an either or. It like there's
Okay.
just so much to this. The first, I'm glad you touched on the analysis of like plant based versus animal agriculture, because yeah, it's the life cycle analysis. So animal ag has done a complex life cycle analysis. So it is from absolutely every piece of the system has been analyzed, and that's not the case for a lot of other industries. Even for like transportation, a lot of times the numbers you see for transportation are tailpipe emissions. So what is strictly coming out of the car, not what is going into making the car, getting it like all of, mining all the
Mm,
different pieces, all the minerals for all the components of the car. And so that's an interesting, topic to kind of dive into. But as far as the local side of things, I don't think it's as easy as just like local versus global. And one of the things I like to highlight is if you go into any grocery store in the United States and buy the plain old conventional milk, it will have come from a grocery store on average less than 100 miles from where you are located. And it takes less than 2 days to get from the farm all the way to the grocery store. So, milk is an
wow.
extremely local product, even when you just buy regular old milk. And you are supporting family farms, the family farms within a 100-mile radius of you. And so sometimes buying local, I think we make it more complicated than it is. And I think milk is kind of unique in that because, milk is a perishable liquid product. So you want to have it as close to the place where you're going to be selling it as possible. But that's a great example of like, you don't have to go to a farmer's market to support a farmer. You can just go to your grocery store and buy milk on the shelf. And it is from a family farm, just like mine, but one that's a lot closer to you in Florida.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think what happens is people see, you go to a grocery store and I don't know all the names. We'll say like Prairie Farms for milk, for instance. Like you see like this brand, and then you just think like, oh, there's a big Prairie Farms headquarters and somewhere in the United States, and they're doing all of the milk and they're shipping it out everywhere. But I don't think people realize that it's like there's farms locally. I didn't actually realize that it was that close. So that majority of the time it's within 100 miles. I had no idea. I don't think I realized that there was that many places in the United States that could handle doing dairy farming to be able to have it come from a 100-mile radius. So I think that's really interesting. So actually, when you're looking at dairy, Lisa and Natalie, I'll let you talk more on the cattle side, but on the dairy side, no matter how you're getting it, you're supporting more local than you realize is kind of what you're saying here.
Yes, there is a dairy farm in every single state in the United States, and
Wow.
it comes from a processing plant a lot closer than what you think. Even if it's a national brand, like if it's a bigger brand that you may think of, a lot of times there are bottling plants for that across the country. And so it's being really localized. It's being sourced. The milk is being sourced from local farms to that plant and then going out from there. And so it's just a different system than what people realize.
Got it. And Natalie, what about on your side
Yeah,
on the
I'm
cattle
always jealous
side?
that Tara has such a cool, like, 2 days, 100-mile radius, like, dairy sustainability story. Beef isn't that awesome, I guess I'll say, but it's still, if you think about it, I mean, that's why I feel like I'm gonna jump around here in my thought process, but I feel like a lot of times people are like, "Well, just put a packing plant, here, and then you can, process everything locally, and then it can be more, local sustainable," whatever you wanna fill in after that. I think our food system got to the way it is for a reason. And again, it was like out of good intention and makes sense, right? So you'll see packing plants where the majority of cattle are raised. There are, states, geographical temperatures, like all sorts of things that go into where cattle can thrive and where you can raise cattle, where they should be grazing. So you see cattle grazing in the parts of the states they're supposed to, and then you'll see packing plants follow that, right? Because we don't want to, you can't ship cattle for long ways on trucks to get to the plants, and so cattle are usually harvested fairly close. They'll find the most obviously local harvesting plant, and then that's where like the feedlot or wherever it is they're coming from, and so it is still local in that sense. I don't think we have like the 100-mile radius like Tara does, but if you probably plop down cattle ranching and packing plants on a U.S. map, you'll see them congregated in certain areas, and it's because the plants are going to be close to where the livestock are grown, and the livestock are grown in the states that it makes most sense to graze cattle. Um, so I don't know if that answers your question totally, but
Yeah, well, I guess that's this idea of you'll, because you get a lot of like purists, right? And I guess one of the questions that I would like to get into with you guys is kind of talking about like regenerative agriculture. But I feel like in the regenerative agriculture community, you get a lot of purists that are like, you should always try to be getting your food from like a local farmer's market because of that reason, right? That like local is, outside of just the fact that you're supporting your local economy, that you're reducing transportation, which is going to have, all these different potential effects on the environment. But then kind of the counter to that you'll hear from a lot of people who are more against that movement is that like, well, that's not practical. There's people who live in these, certain areas of the United States that they wouldn't have access to food if we were to do that, or it's really hard to scale that. So I guess, kind of the question is like, is that something, focusing on, local food systems more, is that something that would be, and I guess, let me give maybe a little bit more practical example. So, I grew up in the Midwest, grew up in Illinois, and a lot of my area was crop farming. So a lot of corn, soybeans, that was the primary farming that was there. Not a lot of cattle farming in that area, like at least in the like area that I know around there. There's not a ton. Since I've moved away, I know a few friends that have kind of started doing some smaller operations there. But I always thought that it was interesting. It's like, okay, well, we live in this like more rural community, but like I'm going to like Walmart to buy meat, right? Like it seems kind of like maybe counterintuitive that like, well, wouldn't it be better to just be able to buy from, the farmer down the road who has this like big plot of land that he could have cattle on? It seems like that would be better for the environment. So like, is that not really a practical thought to say that we could do that across like the whole United States?
I feel like the issue with that train of thought is that we all want to have all of our foods that we love all the time, all year round, right? Like, and I mean, if you're going to
True.
be
Yeah.
buying local, you also need to be buying seasonal, and you like there, it's so much more complicated than that. I know personally, like if I was to quote unquote eat local in Eastern New Mexico, that means I'm going to get milk, I'm going to get beef, I'm going to get green chili, and I'm probably going to get some potatoes and
Green chili.
peanuts. Like that's it. Like that's yay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
I'll
get green
never
chili.
get
I get
green chili
one
in
green
Nebraska.
thing. Yeah, Natalie's not getting green chili, so everyone from New Mexico would probably like die in Nebraska. And so it's just like we want our cake and we want to eat it too. We want all of the foods that
Right.
we have access to. So I think that is a limiting thing about local. And then you think about like, urban food deserts and all of those complexities that like there's not
Mhm.
local food system. We did a story about California last week on our podcast and about how much California grows and all of the things they grow. Like, I love that California would be eating all the food, but the rest of us would not be getting, all these
Yeah. Right.
berries and nuts and a lot of actually plant-based foods is what we wouldn't be getting. And so it's just not as simple as just saying like I'm gonna shop local. Like that's easy to say if you are in a place in the United States like Yuma, Arizona, or in the Salinas Valley of California, or in the southern, Rio Grande area of Texas. But like, yeah, Natalie, living in Montana, I don't know how many different like, fruits and vegetables they were growing up there or in Nebraska. Like, and so that is why we got the food system we ended up having. That's how we got here, is because we wanted all of these different foods at all different times of the
Yeah,
year.
California actually produces over a third of the country's vegetables and three-quarters of the country's fruits and nuts. And so, again, going back to like a
Wow.
true local food system is probably never going to happen again from what we want in our diets all the time. I mean, I don't know. Again, I'm in very rural Nebraska. I mean, we've never tested growing some of those things here. Maybe we have and it failed, but at least in my lifetime, I've never seen an avocado planted here. And certainly don't see, a ton of vineyards
Right.
and things like that. And so, again, I think our food system got to where it is for a reason, on a purpose. Like we didn't just like stumble into the way our food system is built. Um, and so I think along the lines, it made sense. Well, Nebraska, I'm in an area that's called, again, our ranch borders the Nebraska Sandhills. It's a lush, beautiful green area, but it is hilly, it is rocky, and the only thing it's really good for is grazing cattle. So that's what we do here. We don't try and plant anything on that side hill that you can't even get a tractor to. Instead, we're going to take the cow through and graze it. And so, yeah, I think that idea is great in theory, but I think if we were actually trying to implement, a truly local food system, we'd probably come up again to a lot of barriers that our modern day society built on, convenience and dollars isn't probably a fan of. I think what's the most important though is that as a US, we continue to be a self-sufficient nation for food production. And I stand for that, I think, a little bit more
Mm.
than I do like maybe state or local food production. But I think it's really important that, we remain where we are, which, not dependent on other nations to feed us.
Yeah, I think that's a really key component there too. That's something that I hadn't thought about. Like, local can
Mhm.
still mean our country too, versus having to outsource it. No, that's really interesting, and it's because it sounds like you bring up a really good point about like people wanting to have all these kind of diverse foods in their diet. Like, yeah, it's really easy if you're like down here in Florida where I'm at, or out in California, to say to like I can eat locally here, and eat seasonally and get most of my needs, most of my like wants, I guess I should say, more than my needs met, because there's a lot of diversity in what's available around me. But that's not the case for people that are living in, the more central part of the country. So it sounds like the only way that you could really do that is if you were just going to be okay with leaning into predominantly an animal based diet. Mostly carnivore, where you're just, because like as you guys have highlighted, the animal agriculture can happen just about everywhere, but you're not going to be able to get your avocados in Nebraska if you're going to try to eat, locally. So,
That
okay, so
I should
that's
say that would
interesting.
be really expensive, right?
Yeah,
Like you'd see in almonds being more like a luxury, and maybe it is to some people. But I mean, if you could only, maybe they did find somewhere in Nebraska that would grow everything, but it's like it's not going to be a lot. And so it's going to be more of like a luxury item in your diet where you're paying like a high price dollar, to put that again instead of what we do now, which is like a fairly affordable food system.
yeah. No, that's a really good point. And the affordability side is an important piece of the conversation, because a lot of people that are more involved in this side, and I'm guilty of it too. Not from, so I guess I should, before I say, I think a lot of people who are talking about like these kind of these purist animal agriculture movements are typically a little bit more affluent. They can afford to spend extra for these foods and things like that. And I don't fall into the being super affluent category of it, but I do fall into a more unique category of like I will prioritize eating quality food over other things in my life. So I'll remove expenses from other areas to be able to support what I want to do with a diet. But not everybody is in a position to be able to do that, or is willing to do that. So I think the affordability side is something that often is kind of just removed from this conversation. You talk to somebody who's living in New York, in a one bedroom apartment, paying an astronomical amount of rent money with two kids, and you're going to tell them that they need to get everything grass fed within a 10-mile radius of their house. Like, that's not practically speaking. So I do think that that's a really interesting piece. The one thing I want to get into a little bit with you guys is the regenerative side of this, because I know that that's a movement that's blown up a lot more recently. People talking, maybe not more recently, but it's become more mainstream, I feel like, lately. A lot of people who are in more support of the environmental component of agriculture are talking about regenerative agriculture. I've had the luxury of getting to visit a few. One of my friends owns a regenerative farm with Highland cattle out in right outside of Nashville. I'm drawing a blank on the area, Franklin, Tennessee. So it was really cool. I got to go out there and see a bunch of awesome like things about how they were using. They brought in like barn swallows to take care of their fly problem instead of having to spray the cattle with different chemicals to keep them away. So obviously, just not knowing about what it takes to do something like that and how practical it is, like that seems really cool to me. Like, yeah, if we can remove chemical inputs, and rely more on like kind of a more diverse ecosystem to solve some of the problems that we have, that would seemingly be a good thing. What are your guys' thoughts on this? Is this something that you guys are practicing yourself? Is it worth practicing? Is it practical to do on larger like the difference I think in some of these ones that I've gone to is it's smaller operations, of just a handful, like 10 to maybe 15 cattle, versus you guys have these larger operations. So what do you guys think of regenerative agriculture as a whole?
Yeah, I feel like one of the things about regenerative ag that I like to keep in mind is it is like a spectrum. It is not black and white. It is not like I am regenerative, check
Good
that
point.
box, like move on. It is definitely a spectrum, and it is very regional based, which is actually one of the great things about regenerative ag is that it's not like a prescription. There is not like a this is what you do, you are regenerative. It is like what is the best decisions for your area, what your resource concerns are. So in New Mexico, our resource concern is we have no water. We are running out of water. That is not going to be the same resource concern as someone in Illinois or Missouri or in lots of other places. And so thinking about regenerative ag, that it is regionally based and that it is what's best for your farm. And I know Natalie will talk about this, so I won't get into it, but it can vary in a very small amount of area of what actually makes the most sense for each piece of land. And so if you were to like I like asked my husband if we were like a regen farm. He'd be like, "No, we're not." But we practice minimal till. We have done cover crops for years. Like we are doing so
Nice.
many things. We're adding obviously our cow manure to the soils to improve organic matter. We have a super sandy soil here, so improving organic matter is high on our list because improving organic matter improves our water holding capacity in our soils. But, like,
Mm,
we're classified as a, conventional farm, as I've said, but at the same time, we are constantly implementing different things that are moving us more towards regen ag system.
Yeah, I think what's
got it.
interesting you said is it like worth, regenerative farming. And I think it's interesting you worded that way because if you think about farming and ranching, it is absolutely we consider our bottom line, right? So anything we can do, to improve that bottom line, we're going to. And like you said, oftentimes the more self-sufficient or sustainable, the more you can rely on nature, the more you're working with nature. Probably maybe
Mm,
the less, I mean, I'm not going to say it's like a blanket statement, but I will say maybe the more affordable it is for your operation. Um, yeah, regenerative is I'm glad it's catching on in society. I think it's cool that people are starting to associate agriculture with regenerative, and recognizing the idea that like we've talked about this whole conversation that it's good for the environment, that it's needed, that cattle are part of the life cycle. They're actually cattle are a part of soil health. There's like 5 principles to soil health, and the fifth one is a grazing animal on it. And so I think it's cool. I think my fear or concern about it is like Tara said, people are kind of viewing it as well, I'm wondering if they're starting to even think it's like a regulated term too, and it's not, right? It's just a word people are using, which I think is important to point out.
yeah.
Sustainability isn't regulated either. Like those are just two adjectives people are using. Um, but my concern is they're thinking that farmers and ranchers are either being like, yes, we're sustainable or no, we're not. And like Tara said, it's very much so a spectrum of what you can do. So I think a very common operation that people think of when it comes to beef cattle is Will Harris, right? So he's doing really amazing things in Georgia. I think he has a really great working model for his operation. And I think he's doing a lot of positive things for, the way people are viewing agriculture and viewing, cow out grazing. The problem is that people will look at what Will Harris is doing and then we'll look at my operation in Nebraska and say, well, just do what Will Harris is doing. Or, why aren't you doing what Will Harris is doing? You're not being regenerative, you're not being sustainable. And like Tara said, it's so geographically different. I couldn't even do what Will Harris is doing
Mm,
if I wanted to. So there's stocking rates when it comes to cattle grazing, which means you can only run depending on your area, how much grass you have, how healthy the grass is. You can only put so many animals there. We're going to have a very different stocking rate in the central Nebraska than Georgia does, as Texas does, as Colorado would. We're going to have a
mm,
different rainfall. Like Georgia gets way more rainfall than we do, than, New Mexico does. And so that would play a role. The soil type would play a role. Again, our ranches in Nebraska sandhills, that it's called the sandhills for a reason. Like we have sand in our soil. It's very, very different than the soil, Will Harris is working with. And so we're doing, like Tara said, what we consider sustainable in our area for the operation, for the land we have, for the animals we have. And that's going to look different. And so my fear is that people are looking at regenerative as like a copy paste repeat, and it's absolutely not a copy paste repeat. But same thing, like we do cover crops, we rotationally graze. We put in a pollinator habit on our operation. Like we're doing very sustainable regenerative things. It's just not going to be the same as maybe another operation who's doing something sustainable and regenerative too.
that's really interesting. I hadn't really thought about how that would be actually be like kind of economically friendly as a farmer to kind of instill some sort of sustainability practice because you're reducing the
Mhm.
need for external inputs, right, that are going to have costs and take away from the bottom line. How common is it amongst, to use my air quotes for people who are just listening, the conventional agriculture approach? How common is it for people to be doing these like rotational grazing and cover crops like you guys are talking about? Because I think the notion is that that's not very common in conventional animal agriculture. Is that not the case? Is it more common than what people realize?
I would say it's more common than people realize. I think that
Hmm.
there is a lot more going into it than people realize. I mean, I know in our area with our limited water supply, like everyone is trying drought tolerant crops. Everyone is trying to find new rotations that just of their crops that take less water. I mean, I feel like when I was a kid, it was like you grew alfalfa and you grew corn and maybe some triticale. And now it is like my husband planted canola and oats and like then triticale, winter wheat, like all these hay grazers, all these different things, just trying to be like more creative with our crop rotations and what we can grow with less water. And I would say that we're not doing anything like that much out of the norm of what like our neighbors are doing. So I think it is more
Mhm.
widely accepted. Again, it's that spectrum. That's the difference in my mind is like how all in is someone and how are people kind of like, okay, yep, that's working for someone else. I'll go ahead and adopt that. Or like, I'm going all in. I'm going to try this out on my own. I'm going to figure out the way and like kind of paving the path. And so there's kind of like those two different groups of people.
Got it. Love it. No, that's really helpful. I think that's good for people to kind of have an understanding of that because, like I said, I think it is often viewed as black and white, right? It's either you are this like small little regenerative farm that is doing sustainable practice or you're not. And there's like no in between. And I think it's helpful for people to understand that a lot of farmers would be incentivized to practice some of the sustainability, like what you brought up, Natalie, because, I think we all understand that like it's business, it's money. Like some of where we're at in the food system as a whole is a result of the financial component of it. And people are going to be motivated to like if this is a small family operation, as you guys have brought up. You're talking about like a bottom line that impacts your family directly. So of course you're going to be motivated to doing things that are going to help. And it's interesting to know that actually practicing more sustainable animal agriculture would be better for your farm
Well,
in that
and
sense.
sorry,
The
and
other
not to
oh
I like refraining from saying
no,
this because I don't wanna sound like PR-y or sound like, well, of course they're gonna say that because 'cause they're ranchers and
yeah.
farmers, and that's what every rancher and farmer says. But truly, like, our money comes from our animals and our land. Like, that's where our money comes from, right? Like, we're either selling the cattle or the cattle are grazing or their crops going into it. Like, it comes down to having really good animals and having really good land. And like if that's where we make our money, like if you want to look at it at a business standpoint, like we're absolutely going to be obsessing over and analyzing over how we can like make that better, right? If our crops grow better in better soil, that's absolutely going to be at the forefront of every single farmer's minds because if they're going to try and make an income from their living, they can't do it in crappy soil. Like if I'm going to try and make an income from my animal, I can't do it from animals that aren't healthy. And so like I know every farmer and rancher says like we care about our land and our animals, but like we do. Like that's how we make our money. If we're not doing the best taking care of our animals and the land, then like we're not doing a very good job at our operation and we're not going to be able to pass it on to the next generation. And I always love when people are like, you know, ranching and farming is a legacy game, right? Like Tara introduced herself as a fifth generation dairy farmer. I am fourth generation, technically, like on my family's from the ranch I grew up on, Montana. My husband is technically fifth. The operation we created is first, like it's our own operation. But if you think about that, that means people have been farming and ranching in the same area since 1800s. Like, what is not sustainable about that? Like, how can you not, how do you expect to do that for another 100 years if you're not taking care of the land and the soil? So, yeah, again, going back to like it's a spectrum, everyone may not be doing it to the absolute, you know, uh, degree or idea of what a consumer envisions when they think of regenerative or sustainable, but it's like they're absolutely implementing regenerative and sustainable practices because that's the only way for us to exist in our industry.
Got it. I love that. And that kind of brings up something that I want to talk about too. And I know you guys are more on the animal agriculture side of things, but talking a little bit about plant agriculture and how important is it to have? Because again, I grew up in Illinois, where like I said, there was a lot of soybean, a lot of corn farming, but not very much animal agriculture. And with the limited knowledge that I have, it seems like that like the sustainability of that land and being able to continue passing that down, that there could be a finite time period on that. Like if you're not like it seems like animals living out, if you're doing crop farming, animals being there to help contribute to the health of the soil is going to be really important for the kind of the longevity of that practice. Is that something that is that, I guess, for one, is that a true statement that if you're going to be doing kind of this plant farming, plant agriculture, that having that being harmonized with animal agriculture is kind of the key to like sustainable long-term success there? Or are these just kind of two separate things that we really shouldn't be considering together?
I mean, I feel like they absolutely go hand in hand on so many different
Hmm.
levels. For us, like one of the things we do on our dairy is we compost all of the manure that is in our pens. We collect it all and then we compost it like very traditional composting what's in windrows, and we turn it. And what ends up is like what you would think what you buy at your like garden center. Really great composted manure. And that goes out to farms. That's like it almost,
Mm,
my husband always says, like it's a cycle. We bring nutrients in to feed our cows. So we bring a crop in to feed our cows, and we send nutrients out back to those exact same fields so that the farmer can put the nutrients back into their crops, onto their fields, into their soil to grow the crops that then feed our cows. Like it is a great circle of nutrient exchanges between a dairy farm like ours and a row crop farmer. And then on the flip side of that, we've talked about all these byproducts that like our cattle are able to consume. That's a piece of it too. Like we bed our calves in peanut holes. So we work with a local peanut farmer. His waste product ultimately ends up on our dairy. The same with, cotton seeds that I've talked about. Like that's a product those cotton farmers are able to sell to us to feed our cattle. It's an economic like incentive to be like a closed loop system where ag is helping ag and that we're both benefiting from each other. It's this, beneficial relationship. And it's not just, you're not just a single farmer out there like doing it alone. You're a part of this system and working together for like the betterment of all of agriculture.
got it. Yeah, no, I think that's good. Yeah, I mean that's it's something that I've often wondered because it's like it's become as I've become more passionate about this, it's kind of like a goal of mine would be to kind of return to the Midwest at some point and buy some land and do some animal agriculture. I kind of view a lot of these conversations as like it's my kind of PhD in this. I'm trying to get some education about it. And it's something that I've often wondered because, I think about some of the land back there. And of course, like you said, they're still practicing putting manure out to help, or compost manure out there to kind of help with like the soil health. But I wonder how feasible it would be to be able to do that for the long term, or if because you hear some of these like interesting stats about how if we continue at the rate we're going, that you only have like 40 harvests left. I think is one of like the more recent ones that I've heard, which I think is like really rooted in like talk. Like when I hear people talking about that, it seems like they're talking more about the monocropping culture, that's not integrated with animals. If we just keep doing the same crops over and over again, and we're not investing into like soil health, that we're eventually going to run out. So I just wonder, if that's something that if we were talking about like in a perfect world, we're able to introduce solutions to help improve our food system, improve our environment, if that's something that we should be looking into more of, like we really need to be having animals living in harmony with these different crops that we're trying to grow, which I don't, it doesn't seem like is the case everywhere in the United States, but maybe again, that's a misconception that I have.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm a cattle rancher, and so I will always advocate. I think cows
Yeah.
are super. Their integration
Yeah. Yeah.
into agriculture is really important. And yes, I think,
Mhm.
again, they have benefits of the way they graze, their hooves, the fertilization. I mean, there's a lot of different things. So yes, I think keeping animals a part of the agriculture system is, beneficial. Again, that goes down to like, so maybe here's how to also present like the devil's advocate side of it, right?
Mhm.
We got to where we got, I think, because of a reason. So if you wanted to have a farmer who was maybe again using, the monoculture, they're rotating between just corn and soybeans, and that's kind of like what they did. You want them to bring in cattle or, add that extra arm to their operation. Um, it takes a lot to raise animals, right? You have to be like I mean, so you're asking
Yeah.
people then to become experts in multiple areas. And so I think we shifted to where it's like, I'm just going to do crops because I understand crops and I'm good at crops. And I'm just going to raise cattle because I understand cattle and I'm good at cattle. And so I think, you're asking, I mean, we have farmers in our area who do own cattle. I think it's more common that people realize that, farmers are also ranchers. Um, but I think, again, thinking scale and the way their food system is set up, it's like people can't manage that many cattle and run that many acres and deal with everything that goes into being a rancher farmer. It's a pretty interesting job, I would say. You are an expert in a lot of different things, and that is just when you're a rancher. We don't farm because we can't keep up the cost of equipment. Like, if you look at a tractor or a combine, I mean, they're knocking on almost $1 million for some of those pieces of equipment. And so you're asking, like, it changes the way they run their operation from a capital standpoint. Changes the way they run their operation from a knowledge standpoint. So just to simply tell a farmer, like, we'll just buy cattle and run cattle on your crops is like, again, yes, I love that idea because I do think they're a very important part of like maintaining our topsoil, which I think is where people are talking about, like, we only have so many inches of topsoil left, we only have so many harvests left. Comes down to that topsoil level. And cattle are, or ruminants are, absolutely intricate for soil health. But it's not as simple as just the farmer going out and doing that. Then there comes into like calving season. Is that during the same as planting season? Like, there's all of these other things that come into play. And so again, I think we got to where we got because they're like, we'll do the crops, you do the cattle, we'll still work together, to kind of bring, like Tara said, bring in your crops, we'll send out our manure and kind of make that working, almost productive, efficient model. Is that right or wrong? I don't know. Again, going back, we have a safe, affordable, abundant food system. Could we change things and go a different direction? Absolutely. I think people think farmers and ranchers care to the point where it's like we stand for the way our food system is. We're price takers, not makers. We do what the consumer wants. And so I think farmers and ranchers got to running their operations the way they do because consumers kind of told us this is what they want from us.
Yeah. No, that's really, helpful to know because it's more practical, right? Like it'd be, telling somebody who's doing plant agriculture to just start an animal arm of their business. It would be like, I don't know what the equivalent would be. It'd be like an accountant who uses, software for their business to become like a developer, right? Like it's just a completely different job that you're asking them to do. So it's not necessarily practical. Well, that's really helpful. No, I think this has been a really good conversation because I feel like, there's regardless of what side you fall on in this debate, I think that there's a lot of misconceptions and there's kind of this like a little bit of this purist, form, this kind of purist notion forming about like there's only one way to do it if you're going to do it and it has to be done this way. So it's really beneficial to get, like I said at the beginning of this, getting like the insights from people who are actually out there, like in literally in the fields doing this, and being able to like understand kind of the intricacies and how complex this thing really is. So I think this has been an awesome conversation, and to give you guys a chance to tee up, you guys have a docu series, I believe, too. That kind of, I'm assuming, talks a lot more about this stuff too. So do you guys want to talk a little bit about that docu series?
Yeah, absolutely. We'd love to. So we filmed our pilot episode last fall. We actually visited a cotton operation in California. And so the premise of our docuseries, which, like I said, we're kind of in that pilot phase right now, is bringing people along, reconnecting them back to kind of the families that raise their food, and basically the hands that feed us. That's what it's called, Discover Ag Conversations with the Hands That Feed Us. And so the premise would be visiting a different operation, different food source, different product every single episode. And Tara and I would be your hosts, and we would kind of take you along and show you what goes into, raising the food and having some of these deep level conversations so people can feel more connected to where their food is coming from.
And then
Very cool.
on the other side of that is our podcast, which kind of pairs with our docuseries. Our podcast is Discover Ag. Every week we cover the top 3 trending news articles in the ag and food space and kind of give our millennial female farmer rancher opinions and perspective on it, and just try to bring some nuance to these conversations, that things aren't black and white. They're not, as you said, like purist, as people like to think, that there is conversations on both sides to be considered. And we try to bring that to our podcast every week.
Very cool. Well, I'll make sure that to link to those in the show notes, and really recommend everybody go out and give the podcast a listen. Especially, this is like we've had a great conversation in the last hour and 15 minutes, and we've unpacked a lot. But there's a lot more to unpack than what we've gotten into. This is one of those ones where I could go for another 2 hours asking you guys questions about this stuff because I find it so fascinating. But really recommend everybody go out and check it out. Supporting things like this, like we talk a lot about on this podcast, about supporting creators and things, and I think this one is particularly interesting because we talk all the time about voting with our food dollars, right? That's something we talk about with in the food industry, buying the things that you want to support, but we can also do that with our attention, and listening to these things, developing awareness about them, sharing them is a great way to help support what Natalie and Tara are doing, which I think is incredible, and just to help get that kind of information and that conversation continued out there. So really appreciate you guys coming on to the show. This was a blast. If I'm ever out in Nebraska or New Mexico, I want to hit you guys up and come see your guys' operations. Love getting to see the cattle. That's been I think I mentioned to you, I got to go check out the Highland cattle out in Tennessee, and that was like such a cool experience to go out there, rotate the cattle, get to see everything that was going on there. So if I'm ever out in your neck of the woods, I'll be contacting you to get a little tour.
I'll get you on
Absolutely.
horseback, Chris, and we can go for a horse ride and move some cattle
Ooh,
on horseback.
I
All
love
right.
it. I love it. That would be cool. I feel like that's like just picturing that in my head. I think that's about as cool as I
Peak.
will ever be able to look. Is
You've
going to be
peaked.
like cowboy hat riding a horse. Yes, I definitely will have peaked at that
We
point.
do not have horses, but you are welcome to come milk a cow. How about that? That's all I have to
Yes,
offer. Natalie's got way cooler things than me, but you can milk a cow on a
Yeah.
dairy.
I
And then I
love
just
it.
wanna
That's
say, like you
great.
said, we covered a lot here, and if there's anything we covered that you guys have more questions about, you can follow us on our personal channels. Mine's Natalie Kovaric, and Tara's is Tara Vanderdeusen. We love when people ask questions, we're very
Mhm.
open to it, so, maybe it's a question you have from this conversation, or maybe you're following along and you see, I bring my audience along every single day. Like today, we were just out at summer pasture fencing and moving cattle, and so if you see if you have questions about your food system, the best way to
Cool.
get those answered is to find a farmer or rancher to follow online. And so you could start with us too, and then we can always direct you to more people that you could follow too, so that you can again just feel more connected to the people that are growing your food and how it's being produced.
Awesome. I love that. Well, I'll link to, in addition to the podcast and and everything in your guys' website, I'll make sure to link to your guys' socials as well. To echo that, was checking out your guys' socials. You guys put out a ton of really awesome stuff. Really informative, not just what's going on in the farm, but I saw, Tara, you had some really cool videos of, like, in the grocery store talking about dairy and everything like that. So really practical information, not just for somebody who is that owns a farm. There's good information for you, even if you're not a farmer. So yeah, I'll make sure to link to that. So thank you so much for coming on today, guys. Really
Thanks for
appreciate
having
it.
us.
Thank you.
Yeah.